Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to wait just a minute to let others join, and then we'll begin today's discussion. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to wait just a minute to let all the others join, and then we'll begin today's discussion in just a few minutes. Good afternoon, everyone. To everyone who's just joining us, we want to thank you for being here with us today. We're going to wait just a minute to let others join, and then we'll begin today's discussion. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to wait a minute to let others join, and then we'll be beginning today's discussion. Good afternoon to everyone who has just joined us. Thank you for being here with us today. We're going to wait just a minute to let others join, and then we'll begin today's discussion. Welcome to the latest installment of Homeroom with Education Leaders. Today's conversation is focused on shattering glass ceilings, illuminating the path to gender equity and educational leadership. My name is Maureen Stover, and I serve as Deputy Director of the K-12 team here at the Hunt Institute. For those unfamiliar with the Hunt Institute, we were founded by four-term North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt and serve as a resource for policymakers on education issues across the education spectrum through in-person and virtual convenings, research, and other forms of technical assistance. Before getting the conversation started, I wanted to provide a brief logistical overview. We'll start the discussion with about a 30-minute moderated discussion with our panelists, and then we'll pivot to question and answer with the audience. If you have any questions throughout the discussion, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A feature on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll do our best to address your question during the discussion. Additionally, we will record this conversation, and in the next couple of days, we will post it on our YouTube channel. We also encourage you to join us on Twitter, where you can participate in the conversation using the hashtag #EdHomeroom. And speaking of today's conversation, we are so appreciative of the panelists who are joining us today. Women wield significant influence in shaping the lives of children, not just as caregivers, but also as teachers. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, 77% of teachers are women. However, when evaluating district-level leadership, there is a pronounced gender disparity in leadership between men and women, with 87% of superintendents being male. This issue extends beyond gender equity and the challenges for women in leadership. It includes recognizing the inherent value of female leadership and its positive impact on enhancing student performance and empowering girls to lead. In recognition of this importance, today's conversation will discuss the barriers hindering women's advancement in educational leadership as we seek to initiate a thoughtful examination of how the education landscape can intentionally carve a pathway to support more women leaders. To that end, I am pleased to introduce our speakers today. Dr. Julia Rafel is the CEO of ILL Group. Dr. Kendra Washington Bass is the National Designer and Facilitator at the Leadership Academy. And Deepa Purushothaman is the founder of Rewrite. Thank you all so much for joining us. And with that, we'll jump right in. Dr. Rafel, given your extensive fostering leadership development, particularly through initiatives like Women Leading Ed and coaching state education leaders, could you elaborate on how female leadership brings inherent value to the education system? Additionally, what steps or strategies do you recommend for better recognizing and utilizing this value within the educational landscape?
Well, thanks so much, Maureen, and thanks so much for hosting this important conversation. Just a little bit of background. I am the co-founder and partner of an effort called the Forum for Educational Leadership. It is a cohort-based training academy for aspiring district and state superintendents. Over the last 18 months, we've seen over 270 leaders come through that programming. Our first two cohorts that are now a year out have seen a third of them become district and state leaders across the country. I personally have helped hundreds of leaders to navigate their trajectory to either C-suite roles in districts and states and bipartisan administrations, and 55 leaders into the superintendency, of which 57% of them are women and 64% of them are leaders of color. So for the last decade, I have been as close as you probably can be to this part of the space and understanding what happens at all stages of a search process and what happens as women are put into these roles in systems that were fundamentally designed by and for men, for a superintendency that for all intents and purposes hasn't changed since its inception back in 1837. We are still doing things in very much the same ways and expecting to see something different. And unfortunately, that's just not the case. We've seen a complete stagnation for the better part of the last decade in the percent of women who are leading our largest school districts in the country. Have been about 30% for almost a decade now. And that kind of change is what I'm referring to now as the wallpaper problem. We know, just like that wallpaper in your house, that we are a sector that's dominated by women. We know that at every single step, we lose more and more women, and that this is particularly glaring for women of color. And yet we've sort of lost that feeling that we should do anything about it. Like that wallpaper, we're sort of immune to what's going on. And so a big part of our effort with Women Leading Ed is to really try to help to bring a new sense of understanding about the problem, to take research and data and use it to drive strategy, to build the largest national network that exists for women in the space, and to bring the women together to set really concrete goals around what needs to change and how we do something that looks different, to really step on the gas and see something emerge that will change the odds for women. Last April, we had our inaugural Women Leading Ed Summit. We brought together 75 district and state women superintendents and those in the C-suite, and they set a collective advocacy agenda. We developed what is in the chat, the Time Is Now, which is our playbook that's grounded in research and data and insights from the private sector, from what we know from workforce and from HR research. And then we use that to set the agenda for the 5 areas that the women think need to change in tandem if we're going to get to gender equality. We also developed a sign-on letter that now has over 700 signatures from education leaders across the country. The 5 areas that the women have coalesced around as being the most important. Number 1 is the intentional creation of support networks. We're doing this nationally at Women Leading Ed. We've also begun to do this regionally and in states across the country. We think every state needs to have their own women's network and that needs to trickle down within districts as well. Number 2, the entire hiring process needs to be re-examined and re-looked at. Everything from the way that we go to networks to find and source candidates. And so typically those networks that we're going into are ones that are very white male dominated, to how we go about the hiring process, the way that bias seeps in the kinds of questions that are asked that are different for men versus women. And so in the kind of bias training that's going to be required to do something different by those who are in those decision-making roles. Number 3, we've got to change how we think about family and well-being supports. We have to get real as a society about where we are, particularly in terms of elder care responsibility. It is only going to increase These jobs are 24/7. When you are stepping into a superintendency of a district or a state, it is absolutely true that these jobs are incredibly political and they do have a lot of moments in them that are out of your control. But what was in your control is your contract. What is in your control is your agreement with your board, with your governor, and with others around things like off-limit time. This is an area that we're spending more and more time on, and we will be really digging into in our Women Leading Ed Summit next month, so that we can come out of the summit with a model contract that we think is good for everyone, not just for women, but to do a lot more in this area. Number 4, we need to set really clear goals, public goals, and increase our transparency about what's happening state by state. We need to have this as something that every single state is taking on, and that they're driving local solutions around getting to gender equality, setting those goals for their board seats, setting their goals for their superintendents, and making sure they're looking at this as they're looking at the intersection of the size of their districts, looking at rural, urban, suburban. We've been doing this in various states, and we think that this is something that needs to be done not only at the federal level, but also state by state. And then number 5, ensuring financial fairness, equal pay for equal work. And unfortunately, we are so far from that right now for women, not even just at the district level. It's both in first stage contracts, but also even worse in second stage contracts. And at the state level, when we ran our analysis on this, it is a 12% pay gap overall for men and women. It's even worse for the electeds, which are dominated by women. Unfortunately, at the elected level, it's a 26% pay gap difference. So a lot more to say and a lot more to do on this, but I think, from our perspective, there are clear solutions. It's just now about getting everybody on board to take them on.
Well, thank you so much for that. Dr. Washington Bass, you're dedicated to enhancing culturally responsive pedagogy and understanding among students and practitioners. To what extent does the intersectionality of identities play a role in the challenges faced by women in educational leadership? And how can the intersectional perspectives be incorporated into strategies for change?
Thank you, Maureen, and thank you, Julia, for setting the stage. First of all, I'm honored to be part of this exclusive group of women and the work that we are doing to champion equity. So yes, I am passionate about culturally responsive pedagogy. I'm definitely passionate about understanding the intersectionalities. And let me just give credit where credit is due. Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw coined intersectionality in her work to really help us understand the complexities of identity and the crossroads of those identity, and specifically in educational leadership, the challenges that women face in terms of the differences in the myriad of experiences. And so intersectionality reminds us that no individual sort of stands as a monolith. We are a dimension of identities, looking at specific factors such as race, our ethnicity, our gender, our class, our spiritual status, our sexuality. And for women of color, the intersectionality can magnify. And so in thinking about that, we look at the layers of discrimination and the layers of disadvantages that impact women of color. So I want you to sort of think about it in this way. And so for those women of color who are navigating sort of the educational leadership landscape, I want to make an analogy to the curb cut phenomenon, right? Taking it back to a time where disability advocates were fighting for that part of a corner of a curb to have this little dip in order to gain access from the street to the sidewalk. So what did that curb cut do? It allowed not only for those in wheelchairs to get access, but now you're thinking about women with strollers, you're thinking about those with shopping carts, you're thinking about those in bikes, you're thinking about those who have limited ability to get up. So thinking about intersectionality and thinking about equity, when marginalized communities gain access, you are really gaining access for people who you rarely think need that access. And that's why intersectionality is crucial. The other piece about intersectionality is that we also have to think about the LGBT plus 2IA community, who also confront dual challenges around sexism, homophobia, and also making sure that we are representing those women as well. And then also not forgetting like the intersectionality of those who have a certain socioeconomic status. Thinking about all of these things compounds the complexity of intersectionality. And so it is imperative that when we're thinking about women in educational leadership and we're talking about equity, that intersectionality is the lens in which we start. It's the foundation. Because even among women who may appear to look the same, we are very much different and have our own lived experiences that are different. So then how do we incorporate intersectionality into the world or into the change that we're seeking? I think Julia gave a great example of some of the 5 points in which she's doing so. So I'm going to just add a bit to it. One, we have to first acknowledge that we have diversity. We have to acknowledge that there are a myriad of identities and lived experiences that are different from our male counterparts. The second we need to do is amplify the voices of those individuals. For example, if I'm going to a conference on leadership and I look at who is being brought in to talk about leading our schools, transforming our schools, I should see an array of differences along that stage. I should see not only women, but the complexity and the different identities of women and individuals speaking on behalf of those voices that are typically not heard. Talking about reforming our hiring practices, we have to think about dismantling those systems. And Julia, again, said it again, looking at the promotion criteria, that we are not looking at leaders in a singularity way, that the leader is typically white, male, cisgender, with a spouse at home and children who they're taking care of, but that they look like me. And what does that mean? That means that I walk differently, that I sound differently, that my priorities may be different. Also thinking about the training and professional learning that women embark on. Again, the frame at which the leadership looks at what are some of those components and characteristics of leaders have to look different. We're not looking specifically at just buzzwords about what leadership means, but we're looking at making sure that we get the people in the room who can expound on those experiences and then mapping that back to the professional learning that helps us support the myriad of identities. There's also mentorship and sponsorship. So that's two different things. And I really appreciated being part of a Hunt Institute's collaborative last year, where we were exposed to the word femtorship, which is quite different. The ability of women to really network with each other and share those lived experiences and be able to have a group of advocates that not only uplift and amplify the voices, but be able to share those experiences in a way that help us navigate those. And those networks are critically important. It's an opportunity for us to be able to share some of the practices that we've experienced and some of those successes. But I also think it helps us to understand that for women of color, it's not a glass ceiling, it's concrete. There are other layers of obstacles and barriers that some folks don't see. And to be able to navigate those norms, it's like playing, mental gymnastics to try to figure out what's the next route I need to take in order to be able to elevate in my career. And then last, I think thinking about this work, we have to understand the power of advocacy, that we have to be not only at the table, in some cases at the head of the table, to be able to transform policies and structures that have diminished some of our voices. And that means even looking at our board makeup, the decisions made to hire superintendents and those in district level positions, and that the policies that may be inherently white dominated and white dominated ideology need to flip in order to ensure that the voices of marginalized communities and communities of color are at the table. And again, intersectionality is the foundational lens. We can't ask teachers to differentiate and meet the needs of each and every student And as educational leaders, we don't do the same for the people as they navigate the ladder of leadership within organizations.
Thank you so much for that and for really breaking down what that intersectionality means. Deepa, as the first Indian American woman and one of the youngest individuals to achieve a partner status in Deloitte's history, your experiences in the corporate and nonprofit world are noteworthy. Could you share insights on how these experiences inform your approach to supporting your team and challenging conventional expectations, driving positive change, and fostering a culture so that leaders can position their staff for success?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for having this important conversation, especially at this month. I want to start by saying just a little bit more about my background. So I did spend over 20 years at Deloitte. I left in the early stages of COVID, and I wrote a book on women of color and rise in corporate America called The First, the Few, the Only. And so what I'm going to talk about is based not only on my own experience, but interviewed over 500 leaders in writing that book and continue to work with thousands of leaders now as we talk about how we remake leadership. So some of the story and the information I'm going to share really kind of, lies in their stories as well. And so to answer your question, as I looked around, and I was coming up in the firm. When I joined the firm, I was the only one in my start class of 700 that was not an MBA. I was very young, compared to everybody else when I joined. I was also single when I made partner. There were a lot of, challenges around, again, as Dr. Washington Bass talked about, just kind of, identity and intersectionality and different challenges I was trying to navigate at the time I was coming up in the firm. And I remember writing down very early in my career, you don't have to see it to be it. And that is the opposite of what a lot of us talk about, right? I think especially this month, you see everywhere you have to see it to be it. But for those of us that are first and who don't have those examples, we have to find different ways of navigating. And I think that's so important to this conversation, especially because a lot of the research I do now is that so much of what we think is possible for ourselves happens when we're young girls. And it happens based on the teachers we surround ourselves with, the television programs we watch, the books we read. I'm doing research now on fairy tales, right? So just the stories we intake. And we don't talk about that enough. As someone who grew up in this country, my parents immigrated from India. I didn't see anyone on television that looked like me. I never had a teacher that looked like me. I, went through probably until my 20s before I actually interacted with somebody who had some of the same experiences that I was navigating. And so I just think it's important to understand that. So just the stories that we tell and how we remake those narratives is a lot of the work I do now and what I talk about. I also want to just share that part of the switch that happens and what I did for myself as I was coming up in my career is I started to realize that I wasn't going to find one leader or one example that looked exactly like me. And I wish that someone had told me this early on, but I ended up having to find a variety of leaders. And so I also think there's this dissonance sometimes that we think we have to see exactly what's in front of us to be that. And instead, what I found is I looked around, there were amazing partners around me. They happened to be older white men. But I could pick from 6 or 7 of them and find a model that worked for me. There were some spaces that were challenging, right? Giving feedback to people who were much older than me, or, entertaining clients as a young single, woman. I had to entertain clients in a different way, maybe not over drinks and dinner, but maybe over breakfast, right? Just things I had to learn on my own that I think I would have navigated differently if I had, other maybe mentors or sponsors that looked like me. But I think that's also something we have to rename and remake. Part of this dialogue is also shifting to realizing that part of what we have to find is ways to show up in our power that is authentic to who we are. And I learned that as I was actually leaving my corporate career. So I left during the early stages of COVID. And one of the things I did to start to figure out what do I want to do next was to gather very senior women and women of color in dinners. And these were dinners of 20 and 30. And I did about 15 of these across the country and ended up meeting 300 or 400 very senior women. But I remember in the first dinner in San Francisco, we had a public company CFO at the dinner. And within the first 10 minutes, she looked around the room of 20 of us and she said, I sit in a seat of power as a public company CFO. And it's a company you would know if I named it, but I don't feel powerful. And the entire room got really quiet. And we all started shaking our heads. And it was for different reasons, right? I was really sick later in my career. So for me, I was out of alignment with my health, right? For other women, it was, we're trying to balance too many challenges at home and trying to always feel like we're not doing enough anywhere. For her, it was that she was very senior in her career. She was a Black woman and she had muted speaking up about certain topics because she was trying to rise. And here she was in her almost 60s, so or about to get to retirement stages, and really considering, did I do enough? Did I say enough? And part of what we don't talk about enough is right now leadership, we ask people to conform to rise. We ask them to be in a certain way of leadership. And when I talk on stages, sometimes with big audiences, I'll ask them to close their eyes and I'll ask them to think about a leader. Who do you picture? What are they wearing? What do they look like? What do they sound like? And often, again, I've done this now at least 50, 60 times, the room will typically say it's a white man in his 40s or 50s. He's got salt and pepper hair and he's wearing a blue power suit. I then ask them to close their eyes and I'll say, I want you to think of someone you admire, someone who you want your kids to be like, someone you want to be more like. And more often than not, I hear I want them to be like my mom, my grandmother, Mother Teresa, right? Gandhi, just not archetypes we think of when we think of corporate leadership, or we think of politicians, or we think we ask people to picture that sort of leadership. And I think that's a lot of the shift that we're seeing, and a lot of the work that I do now is really encouraging people to realize that leadership can look different, but we have a very narrow definition of what we think is a leader. And that really influences who we think is executive ready or who is ready for a leadership seat. And until we open up those definitions, until we make space for things like empathy and caring, consciousness into how we lead, those things become very bifurcated. And it's sometimes hard for people who look like me to actually have space to lead. And so to answer your question, a lot of the work that I do now is really about not just helping women get to the seats, but how do they actually lead in authentic ways to them? How do they lead in full voice when they get there? Because it's not just about getting women to the seats. It's really about how we make more space for more of us to lead in ways that are going to allow for change.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. I would love to follow up for all of you. And as I do, I just want to make a quick reminder to everyone in our audience to please submit your questions to our panelists in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Each of our resource experts have encountered diverse barriers in their journey to becoming leaders, CEOs, or directors in their respective sectors. With more women in places of leadership, the representation can pave the way for more young women to lead in the workforce. Can you share examples of successful initiatives that have effectively promoted and supported the advancement of women in leadership roles? And Dr. Rachel Bear, we'll go to you first, and then we'll go to Dr. Washington Bass and Deepa.
Well, thank you for this. I've shared a little bit about the network that we've created, Women Leading Ed, but I just want to just go back a little bit in time to how we started on it and share when it wasn't so successful and sort of how we've done this. So the work of Women Leading Ed, it actually began 6 years ago. I was the former chief operating officer of a national nonprofit called Chiefs for Change. I'd come in at the very start of the turnaround of that organization. I was the third employee hired, and I built every piece of that organization. And one of the key initiatives for the organization was a leadership development program that I built called Future Chiefs. It's a cohort-based model, not dissimilar to what we've now spun off for the Forum for Educational Leadership. It was very, very selective, only 8 or 9 people in a cohort. As we were getting to cohort 3, we were hitting our overall metrics, but we realized that we were not having the same kind of success with women that we were with men. And in fact, when we looked at our data, only 1 woman had actually landed in the superintendency, and she was a succession plan, not even a sort of typical pathway. When we looked at even those that were stepping into the search to begin with, it was incredibly concerning. Only 23% of our women had stepped into a search compared to 86% of our men. And so I stepped back. It was like such a moment for me, because I was the first person who each of the women was telling why they weren't going for a search. And I started to realize how similar some of the risk pattern and their assessment of risk and how different that looked than men. Women were constantly hearing one piece of information and locking in. They were told the board doesn't want a woman. The board already had a woman superintendent a few superintendents ago. They're looking to go in a different direction. Or they'd hear the board's too complicated. They'd hear, I won't get the salary I want. Men, it didn't even matter. Like, they could have heard all of the same things about themselves, and they still were applying for the job. And so I stepped back with 2 incredible women, Hannah Scandera, who at the time was the longest serving superintendent working for Governor Martinez, who was the first Hispanic woman governor in the Republican Party. And then Dr. Lillian Lowry, who passed away a couple of years ago, had been a successful state superintendent under 2 Democratic governors and had been in the district level. So women with incredible credibility. We said we would just start an affinity group for the women. We would do it once if that's all they needed. And when we came together, we showed them their data. We let them know what was happening, and they were so shocked. They knew their own personal experience. They did not realize that this was a collective experience. And they told us they had no other network like what we were creating. Within under 2 years of starting that network, our women were stepping into searches at equal rates as our men. It was 84% of the women who'd stepped into a search compared to 86% of the men. And we surpassed our men in terms of placements. Bringing the women together in a network, showing them the data, setting collective goals, holding each other accountable for those goals. And then when women got that job, making sure they were as supported as possible to be as successful as possible with a team behind them was enormous in all of this. And so in 2021, we spun off, we created Women Leading Ed. We wanted this to be a free national network for as many women as possible. We wanted to expand the offering and really ground in research and data, which is what led us to create the Superintendent Research Project, which is what we put out annually, the insights around the top 500 largest districts. That's how we know that we've seen the stagnation in the 30% mark, and we track it. We also look at how women are getting into that role. So we've been looking at pathways, and what we've learned is that it is very rare for women to get into these top 500 largest districts when they're the external candidate, meaning no connection to the district. Much more likely is when they serve as the internal. And in fact, if a woman serves as the interim, nearly half the time she's placed in that job. Now, on one hand, this is bias, right? Women have to show that they can do the job. They have to knock it out of the park before they're trusted to do it. But it's also really helpful strategically. It makes us realize how important succession planning is. It makes it that much more important to make sure women are getting in front of boards, that they feel comfortable talking about finance, operations, contracts, all the things that we know are the way that bias plays roles in these processes. And so we use that information to really drive strategy and insights. We've been taking a look at board composition. When you have boards that are 75% or more female, you are more likely to choose a woman in those roles. And lots of other regional insights as well, so that we can continue to get smarter about this. And then just this week, we put out our first insight survey. We surveyed more than 100 women in superintendent roles and C-suite roles across the country. And we have a much fuller picture about what's happening for women in educational leadership and much clearer insights about what we need to do. Unfortunately, there's a lot of it that's really tough to read. 8 out of 10 women report that they feel external pressure to change how they dress, how they speak, how they behave. More than half of women say that they feel like their gender is impacting conversations and negotiations around salary. And in fact, 8 out of 10 women say they've never even received support or training in how to negotiate. So we're going to be doing a lot more there as a network and really trying to take on issues around salary and around contract as a big piece of our agenda moving forward.
Thank you. And Dr. Washington Bass, would you like to weigh in on that question as well, please?
Sure. Again, there's so many threads through the 3 conversations. One I would want to just start with is just the socialization. One thing that Julia mentioned was, what may be prohibiting women from sort of getting in the arena, and to talk a little bit about that conditioning that happens. And she is absolutely right. I think about the number of women that my partner and I sort of talk to in our own experiences. We tend to wait to check off certain boxes before we even apply. So for example, if there is a list of 10 criterion that is in a job application, women feel like we have to meet almost all of them, or 8 out of 10, compared to our male counterparts. Is like, oh, that one thing I'm applying, right? It's just thought. And for us, it is this socialization about what our worth is. And for women of color, again, intersectionality, and I'll speak for myself, I felt like I needed to check off multiple boxes. I needed to hustle in a way that made sure that I went to the best schools, best education, that I signed up. I think back to my childhood and understanding the lessons that my family, my grandmother, my mother taught me, sit at the front of the room, raise your hand, make sure you have your voice, be seen, work harder, 10 times as harder as the other person next to you in order to get half, right? Just to get half. And that stuck with me as an educator, that stuck with me as a leader. And when it came time to putting my name in the hat for certain things, I felt like I needed to do one more thing before doing it, just one more thing. So have my master's, have my BA, have my master's, have a specialist, have a doctorate. For some, they have double doctorates, right? Just this ladder climbing to do so. Meanwhile, we miss out on opportunities. We potentially can miss out on opportunities. So that's the first thing. It's just this social conditioning of waiting to fill out the perceived sort of boxes that's out there. I think the second thing too has to do with what we both shared, Deepa and Julia, is this concept of our own well-being and the boundaries that we set related to those. So when we're meeting with each other, and I'm meeting with women through some networks, there's this whole conversation around that hustling, the things that we tend to do tirelessly and we get burned out. So while we're doing all the things, we don't have time to rest, which leads to maybe we've gotten to that position or we are leading in that school, but we don't stay because the boundaries that have not been set allow for us to be pulled in many ways that are different than some of our male counterparts. And so the opportunity to think about the way that we lead that attends to our well-being that is different than others. And then the other piece that I'm also seeing is when we have these networks or we have these gatherings, it's not enough to gather and have that moment and go, all right, now go out and do that, right? It is important to not only talk about the challenges that we face and hear the, again, intersectionality of the stories among women, but it's what is it that we can do from a structural standpoint to make some changes? And how do we elicit our accomplices and co-conspirators in doing so? And I want us to get away from the fact that it's just me. It's that I have to be the person to fix it, that we have to go hand in hand with our allies, with our accomplices, with our co-conspirators to make that shift. And so there's some examples that are out there of women organizations or organizations that are doing it. Is Julia's organization, Women Leading Ed. There's the WIN network from National Association of Secondary School Principals. And there are many networks within states that are bringing women together to have these critical conversations. AASA has their Women's Institute and their networking. There is the Ed Leaders of Color organization that specifically is supporting leaders of color, but they also have women networks. I mean, there's my organization, Lucy Leadership Project, where we're doing work with women to talk about well-being and boundary setting and creating those networks and spaces to do so. The last thing that I will say around this is that this is incredibly complex. And we're talking about undoing hundreds of years of a system that wasn't built by us and for us. So Julia talked about, the early 1800s. We can go back 1600s. I can go back in my own ancestral history and being denied the ability to learn, to read, and how that seeps into the current educational fabric of what reading disparities and inequities look like. And until we address those disparities head on and actually call them out explicitly, it'll be difficult for people to be able to make those changes. That comes with risk. That comes with courage to do so. But it also comes with the network needed to support that push when we need to make that when we have to make that push in order for women to finally have not only the seat at the table, but be at the head of the table. It's not enough to just have a seat, right? Y'all can pull up and still be muted, as Deepa said, right? It's like, I want to feel like that dinner table, that I'm powerful in my work.
Thank you. And Deepa, if you would like to unmute and also Wayne, we'd love to hear from you as well.
Absolutely. I'll maybe just give you two simple examples. And I know I'm seeing lots of questions come in, so I know there's lots of interest. So when I was within the firm, one of the programs I did early on as a new partner was I was matched with a senior partner, and it was an attempt to kind of, just a development program, let's call it. I think there was so much that I learned in that program. One, even as I do research now, what I find is that we don't often tell high potential women, and especially women of color, that they're high potential. So there was something to being tapped and being told I was high potential that was actually very important, that I think we need to do more of. But the other thing that I learned in that program is it was a year-long program where we were given scripts every month, and it was kind of a question and answer where you got to know someone in a very different sort of way. And the second month that we did the program, the person I was matched with, his name was Jerry. We both walked into the room the first session. Neither of us wanted to be there. We looked at each other and thought, like, I have nothing in common with this person. It's not going to be a great session. He called me a whippersnapper. It was like it was an entire, experience. But the second session, it was about imposter syndrome. And we were supposed to come in with some of the challenges that we face, and especially as women of color, I think we tend to have a higher level of imposter syndrome. And it's not all us. A lot of it comes from the messages from the systems around us, as we've heard. But I remember going in with my list of 14 things, and I think I got to point 6, and Jerry stopped me and said, don't you think I have all of these same issues? I just don't walk around talking about them all the time like you do. And we had this great discussion that I think as men, he was told to fake it till you make it. And as a woman, I'm still trying to figure out, what does that look like for me, right? Because if I fake it, I get different feedback. And I share that to say that experience with him really changed my career trajectory. He became a huge sponsor. And it wasn't that it was such a work-related conversation. It was that we got to know each other as people. And I think sometimes the real breakthrough happens when we get to connect with people and have a different sort of conversation. The other example I want to give you is when I left the firm, one of the first things I did is found an organization for senior women to come together. We thought it would be mostly corporate. It ended up growing and becoming a lot of entrepreneurs. And we actually had a lot of professors join from across the country to be in community. And within the first quarter, so we were only up and running maybe 3-4 months, we did a survey just to hear what people were feeling about the community. And 25% of the survey participants, and we had a good wait list of like 6,000 or 7,000 within the first few months. But 25% of the women said just from seeing other women ask for more, push back on their roles, or quit, they felt comfortable doing the same. And I think you've heard that from both of the other participants. Like, part of what we don't recognize is that seeing models, seeing people do it differently, especially women, giving ourselves permission to push back and to rewrite. That's why my new company is called The Rewrite. We don't often recognize that we can, push back. We can change things. We think we have to do what's come before. And I just think there's such power in storytelling, such power in coming together. And what I find with a lot of the women leaders that I work with is that we think it's just us. We think it's our problem. We don't realize that a lot of us are navigating the same challenges. And so if we can open up conversations, if we can find ways to share our experience and talk about changing together, the real power, as was said before, I think comes from, I call it the power of me and the power of we. You need both. You need to figure out what you want, who you are. But in order to make change in difficult systems that have been here for hundreds of years, we need to work together to do that. And I do think change is possible, but it takes really different kinds of conversations, really different kinds of energy, and realizing that we can make change and seeing models of how to do that even in small ways.
Thank you. And as Deepa mentioned, we do have lots of really great questions coming into the Q&A. So really at this point, we would love to turn to start answering some of those questions. So the first question, and any of you are welcome to answer this. How can we change or monitor the ways in which we recruit leaders or the selection of leaders if the women are never given an opportunity to apply? And anyone is able to answer that question if you would like to unmute and answer.
Just do me one more favor. Just reread that one more time so make sure the entry point to answering that.
Absolutely, happy to do that. How can we change or monitor the ways in which we recruit leaders or the selection of leaders if women are never given an opportunity to apply. So I think it's insinuating if women are never given the opportunity to actually apply for the position or apply for leadership positions, how can we change the way that that's being addressed?
And I'm happy to share from my perspective, and you know, I've seen hundreds of these processes play out. I think it's really important to remember that search firms are not your agents. They're not your friends. You being in a search is a business transaction. And for women, and particularly for women of color, be very wary when a search firm reaches out and says that you're perfect for a role. And then you call me and you tell me they said that I'm perfect for the role. They said that to 50 other people too. That's their job. And their job is to keep you in the search all the way to the end. They don't want you to back out, not if you're in the finalist pool. In some of these searches, there are incentives to be able to have more diversity in the finalist pool. And sometimes you're literally being used to fill a metric. That's real. And I think at some points, we're just not direct enough in how we talk about these things. And so we are very intentional about that in our network. And we're very intentional about talking about it. But it's also why networks really matter. It takes networks to vouch for you. It takes networks to vouch for your results. You can do the best possible job in how you lay up your materials. Especially for women, you need to speak in metrics. You need to talk about your financial chops. You need to talk about the size of the teams that you're overseeing. And that's all stuff that we help to provide you with support on. But then it's on you to make sure that you are using your networks to your fullest. If you're applying for jobs through LinkedIn, who knows people, who sits on boards that you know, and asking them to do that outreach. Ultimately, in all of these things, these processes, there's no one single way. Some of these searches really are meant for somebody and they're just up there to get to the candidate they want. And other times they're real. For us, we think data matters. And so we think reporting out on metrics about finalist pools, even if it's done just providing the overall demographic information and sharing that out is really important. We think districts should do that for all open roles and report that out to the board. We think it is really important for states to hold their districts accountable. When states put out lists, people respond. That's real. And being able to do that and have those kinds of public conversations, we think really matter. Last, I'd say, you know, we took a project that we did with the state of Texas. If you go to our website, you can see a report that we put out around the state of the superintendency in Texas. And then we supplemented that with qualitative interviews from women on the ground about what they thought. And the biggest piece of feedback was that at every level, from principal roles all the way up to cabinet roles to the superintendent, women believed that having that demographic information out there could go a long way, and being able to look at that across regional centers and others doing the search in order to better understand the kinds of metrics and how different entities running searches were supporting or thwarting the overall gender equality goals in Texas was a big recommendation, and one that we think could go a long way state by state.
Thank you. Kendra, did you want to also add something?
I mean, I think Julia answered that question great. I guess my simple response is apply, right? Just stop waiting to be picked. Stop waiting for, do what I did, which was like check off all the boxes, begin applying, activate the network. If you are not part of a network, this is an opportunity to be part of one. You've heard about some examples of networks right here on this webinar. Begin creating the community of support so that you can get the advocacy needed to help you. And yes, have your stuff in order, right? Be able to talk about your successes, be able to talk about the way that you form teams and support them, be able to talk about how under your leadership, students have this culture of care and belonging and academic success, hit those things, but you have to put yourself in the arena. Critics are always going to be there. So get into the arena. And that really means begin applying. Do not wait to be picked.
Thank you. Another question we have is, how do we build an understanding of what needs to be fixed in the system? And how can women be structural leaders tackling the complexities of the system?
For me, I think it comes from conversations, and a lot of the work that I do is bringing together women to talk about how you change structures. And I think sometimes we're so busy, we're overwhelmed, we're trying to do other things, but we are also change makers. And so I think it's finding spaces, finding places, finding co-conspirators, finding allies, and just engaging in the discussion. And you have to find the right groups and the right places for that discussion. But I think if you do, you really, and there's a lot of research, especially recent research that HBR in particular has put out, Harvard Business Review, around how making change happens when you find teams and you find other people within your organization and outside of your organization. So I think there was a big theme around networks, but that's what I would suggest, is just start having those discussions. And it comes with practice. Like, you have to, it doesn't come naturally to go sit in a room or over a dinner and say, let's talk about changing the system. But I think you have to, intentionally set the space and have discussions to really talk about what's not working first, and then talking about what needs to change.
I think that point, Deepa, is exactly right. I mean, being able to talk about this stuff and say these things out loud, certainly not the way it was when I was assistant commissioner in New York to John King. We didn't talk about these things. I didn't even understand the experiences that I was having were so common for so many other women. The constant unwanted sexual advances, the constant undermining of my leadership. I had no idea. I thought it was just Albany culture. I literally didn't understand. And it was only over the better part of the last decade, as I've worked with hundreds of women across the country, that I start to realize, actually, this is the lived experience of so many. And that was the point of the insight survey that we put out this week, was to help to really illuminate that these issues are issues that many are having. We need to speak in a different way and together in one voice. I do think on the structural side, though, one area that I am really focused on is the incredibly bad coaching we give to women. We are creating a skewed pipeline that is so dangerous. Whoever is doing most of the work at the early stages needs to really step back and make sure that their coaches are trained in the way that bias is seeping in and how they're telling women to go about their career. Many teachers are being told that they should go into the elementary school principal pathway, that from there, they should go into the academic side of the shop. Maybe then they go into talent and HR. Maybe from there they go into a deputy role, but usually they're timing out in terms of retirement. Men are being told to go from teacher more often to high school principal. That high school principal role has maximum exposure. You're exposed to the board, you have graduations, you have football games, you have basketball games, you have a much different size budget, student population, and the issues you're dealing with are seen as more adult. And so suddenly when those central office roles are opening up, sometimes that high school principal is going straight up to the superintendency, but sometimes they're going then into things like chief of schools or deputy and overseeing more of the operational and finance, which are all job traits that matter a ton for the superintendency. And so the skewed pipeline problem in how we are coaching and providing mentoring and induction supports is something that we think everyone who's taking on Grow Your Own efforts really needs to address. It's why Women Leading Ed is partnered up with the National Center for Grow Your Own. And we're really trying to get this right as people are developing their Grow Your Own strategies, so that we really start to rethink the way that we are addressing the skewed pipeline problem.
And Julia, you just hit a ding, ding, ding in my head about that mentorship. And for women of color, my own sort of training to mute, to be small, to not speak for safety reasons. I understand where that mentorship came from in the environment, but that was time bound, right? And so thinking about current state and what that can actually do in terms of damage to not only the career trajectory I wanted to be on, but damaging to my identity and authenticity of the way that I even saw myself. And so, just being very conscientious about who you choose, as Deepa, you described the network you choose to be in, that it is uplifting, that it is centering you as a person first, and really developing who you are, because you're going to show up and lead the way you are. It is going to be very tiring to mask these different identities you want to try to play around with it. I mean, already as a Black woman, the intersectionality, mental gymnastics is tiring. Then I have to try to show up for somebody else again, so that I think you hit a nerve when you share that, just because on a personal note, that happened with me and how I felt, and it was from another woman of color. And so thinking about, these opportunities to sort of select and curate the people who are going to be your coaches and those networks that you're going to be in, be discerning about where they are. Ask people about what they're getting out of them. Ask them about their metrics. Like, so if I'm in this network, what do we see in terms of women progressing and sustaining and thriving in the role? What additional supports am I being given while I'm in the role? And what is the advocacy that's happening on the background? So how do you determine those structures? The first thing you have to do is see them. You have to talk about them. And the hard part to sort of talk through this is you also are complicit in them. Like, the structures don't exist outside of the human people who are moving them, right? I'm perpetuating the structure as a Black woman too, right? So being able to even recognize my DNA in the systems and structures that operate, you have to be able to see them first before you can do anything about them.
Thank you all so much. So we have time for one more question. So would love to just hear your final thoughts on, if there was a young woman who came to you today and told you that they want to be an educational leader, what would be the advice that you would give to them?
I'll start this time. That's an interesting question, because advice giving is maybe what I want to do. Maybe it's more questions. So I guess I would ask the question, why do you want to do it? What's your purpose in terms of what's going to drive you? How do you want to experience the joy of work? Because those questions probably allow me to really understand the way they want to move and how they want to find that experience within either a school district or within an education organization or policy organization, where they can be their full selves. So I guess I would ask the question, so why do you want to do this? To what end? How do you want to experience joy in the work, and how do you want to move? And then continue the conversation. Like, I would not leave that person alone, and I definitely would give them some thoughts about networks that they can be part of that will help them on that journey and give them the skills and the language and the support needed in that way.
Thank you. And then either Deepa or Dr. Rafel-Bear?
Yeah, I'm happy to go. I would say, and this isn't specific to if they came to me and wanted to be a teacher, but I think we end up working in a lot of cases without intentionality. And when I work with women, I ask them to sit down and figure out, what kind of leader do you want to be? How do you want to show up? What does success look like to you? And I think if, we did that earlier in our career, even maybe before we picked our careers, and we could, lay that out, I think it would just help drive a lot of how we show up in the world, because you're going to get a lot of pressure, regardless of who you are, where you are, to be different than how you want to show up. And so I think it's really important to know who you are, and then find the right places and the right spaces that allow you to water that and to really, grow your roots around that.
That was great advice from both of you. I mean, I'm obviously very biased, because I think everyone should be stepping into these roles. I think they're the most impactful roles. I think the ability to push through the politics and do incredible things for kids is amazing in these jobs. I think if you are a leader who is looking to have the most maximum impact on the most maximum number of kids and families and educators possible, you absolutely should get yourself on a path to these roles. It is incumbent on us as a society to change our definitions around what we think a leader is, to move beyond this idea of being aggressive and decisive and tough, and to really embrace so much more of a different perspective that women do bring, that level of empathy and that ability to bridge collaborative relationships is what makes women so great in these roles. And we need to do more to really push on that. And it means we have to do a ton more in terms of how we help the media to better understand stories of impact, which is certainly what we do every single day at Women Leading Ed. We need to do that across all sectors in a much stronger and cohesive way. And we have to tell stories. Storytelling, we know, is such a critical part of how you get your leadership across, but how you get others to want to lead you. The last thing I'd say in all this, I think there's some amazing research, both from the medical world and the political science world, around what happens when women are in these roles. And in particular, in the medical world, studies have shown that female doctors tend to listen more, that their patients, both male and female, tend to fare better. And I think it's really important that we listen and look at that kind of research and start to really apply it and look at replicating it much more so in our sector. We've certainly been noticing that with issues like school closures. Look at the way that women have been approaching it versus the way that men typically have. Very different kinds of outcomes and results right now. And we think you could look at that at a range of policy issues and really start to shift the narrative about what happens when women lead.
Thank you so much. And thank you again to our wonderful panelists for joining us today for this engaging conversation. Before closing today's session, I do want to turn everyone's attention to our upcoming K-12 webinars. Our next K-12 conversation will be held on Thursday, April 18th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, where we will discuss the barriers for neurodivergent learners and learning loss. We'll drop the registration link to the webinar in the chat. We also encourage you to join us for our other upcoming Hunt Institute webinars listed on the screen. You can register for these webinars by going to our website, which we will post in the chat. Thank you again for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon.